sort of doing announcements before doing sort of announcements, whatever I was doing. I forgot to remind you that this Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. Service at 7:30 here. I didn't say that, did I? No, I 7 service at 7:30 here. At the 8:30 service, I asked them a question because since way before my time, St. Mary's has never been strong on what are called the occasional services, like Ash Wednesday, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday. And I was just wondering if it would be a more convenient time, instead of 7:30 in the evening, to have it earlier, like let's say 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. Would that make it more reasonable for people? I know there's some people in our congregation who don't like coming out at night. But there was a very underwhelming response to that, so I think we'll keep the time at least this year as usual. So 7:30 Wednesday, and we'll be doing it up in the chapel there, I think, and we'll set it up in a bit of a different way. So that was an announcement I should have made before. Sometimes when we read the Bible stories or the Bible lessons on Sunday morning, I regretted a bit that we don't do the gospel first, followed by the epistle. And I gotta say, I wonder why they originally structured it that way. I don't know why. Because in the gospel, you get the story that resulted in the epistle, or the epistle results from the gospel. And such is the case today. The story of Jesus, he's talking to a whole bunch of people, and then he comes across some fishermen. We'll talk about that in some detail in a bit. And then when we read the epistle reading, which is Paul's epistle reading, there's all these stories about how Jesus appeared to people. And it seems to me that the epistle follows, well, it does historically follow from the gospel. And I think it might have flowed better today if we'd done it backwards. However, we are Anglicans and loyal, so we did it the way we did it. And so you can talk about the gospel first, and then the epistle, and then tell a story. Just to refresh your memory, and also because this is going on YouTube for people who haven't heard the gospel read. Okay? It's the story where Jesus comes down to the seaside. He's done his preaching thing, and he comes across some fishermen. And there's 2 boats there, and that's not an uncommon thing, because when you're doing net fishing, you have one end of the net with one boat, one end of the net with another boat, right? And then you stretch the net, let it go down, and then the boats go together, the fish swim into the net, etc., etc., etc. So he comes down, and it's clearly daytime. And he asks if he could get into the boat and go out a ways. And these fishermen have been at it all night, and they haven't caught a thing. Not sure if this is telling tales out of school, but in those days, you've heard of dynamite fishing in our day and age. You know, you go to the bayou, you throw a 4-stick of dynamite in, boom, and guess what? All the catfish come out because they've been stunned. Well, they didn't do dynamite fishing in those days. They had no dynamite, but what they did was they did lantern fishing. There would be lanterns at the bow and the stern of the boats, and the fish, of course, would be attracted to the light. They would come up to where the net was, and then they'd just be scooped up. So imagine the scene. Middle East, very primitive conditions, you know, no Merc Cruiser, 250 horsepower gigs here. You've got a handmade net, probably significant in size, but certainly not like a dragon that we would have today. And you've had these guys at it all night, with their lanterns in their boat, with the net stretched between them, going up and down the water, and rowing or paddling, because there's no power. So they have worked hard all night. And for one reason or another, they haven't caught anything. They have caught nothing. Now, maybe, since these guys, and sometimes in the stories there's a little bit of hyperbole, maybe they caught a minnow or 2. Probably not. It was swept through the holes in the net. But it has not been a good night for fishing. So Jesus comes on board. They go out onto the body water. And he says something that to them as fishermen is absolutely absurd. He says, "Let down your net again." Clearly, he is a carpenter and not a fisherman. He has no clue what is involved in getting a net set, getting a net rigged, getting a net out there, fishing all night, catching nothing, and then having to bring the net properly aboard, folding it properly and all the rest. He has no idea how much work is involved in that. To say the absolutely absurd thing, let down your net again. And Jesus is sort of, see what happens. Because I suspect Jesus knows what's going to happen, otherwise he wouldn't have said that. And so they say, "Oh, come on, man. No, actually, that's what I'd say. They might have said, oh, Jesus, or something. I don't know what they would have said. But he said, oh, like we were at this all night and we didn't catch anything. And now you want us to put down the nets again? And no, ridiculous. I'm not a fisherman. I wish Phil was here today. Because he would go, yeah. I sort of said, I move over to the fisherman. But if Phil the fisherman was here, one of the things that Phil would say, well, anyone who knows anything about fish, during the heat of the day, the fish go down where the water's cool, right? They don't hang up at the top unless they're floating belly up. That's the only fish you see on the top of the water. Dead ones, or ones that are soon to be dead. The healthy fish, they go down where it's cooler, and they come up at night to feed, right? You knew that, right? Yeah, you with me? I'm not making this up. Okay, so Jesus is asking them to go through all the trouble of rigging the net from boat to boat, letting it out after they've just got it in, and a wet net is a lot heavier than a dry net, and set up at the worst possible time of the day to catch fish. Why should they do that? Like, why? Who is this guy? Well, we've been fishing all the night, and we haven't caught a thing. And here is where I think the gospel, like, they must have had a break for commercial and left some interaction out. Because if I was one of those fishermen, I would have had a discussion with Jesus before saying, but nonetheless, we'll do as you say. It seems to me there's a whole section missing there. The argument, the banter, Jesus standing, he knows who he is, and it just skips to this part, and it's a shortcut. It's got to be a shortcut. It can't be anything else. So they let down the net, and depending on which version you read, abundance of fish, the nets are bursting, etc., etc., etc. And it's in that interaction that the fishermen, and I'm not going to single any of them out, the fishermen turn to Jesus and recognize his uniqueness. Because as fishermen, they just realize what a spectacular thing this is. The laws of nature have just been broken. The laws of fishing. But fishing is based on the laws of nature. You're only going to catch fish in water. That's one of the laws of nature. You're not going to catch them on dry land. You're only going to catch fish if there are fish to catch. That's a law of nature. You're not going to go, here, fishy, 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 and like in Sesame Street, have the fish jump into the boat. I think that's Sesame Street, wasn't it? Yeah. It's not going to happen. And you're not going to catch fish in the heat of the day. There's thermoclines in the water, the various temperature layers, and the fish are down here during the heat of the day. They're not up here. So the fishermen realize that something supernatural has happened. The laws of nature have just been changed. And they've been changed by him. And so, probably confused, probably a little bit frightened, maybe not. I'm saying probably. Maybe I should put in perhaps confused, perhaps frightened. Perhaps just wondering, maybe a little bit of awe thrown in. They say something that recognizes the uniqueness of the event as it is embodied in that individual. The event is special, but they realize that the source of that event has nothing to do with the fish in the water, it's to do with him standing right there. And in that moment, because Jesus engaged with them directly and personally on a level that they could understand, completely understand, he became to them their Lord. In other words, simply put, he appeared to them at a time, in a place, and in a manner to transform their life. So that's the gospel reading. We then go to the epistle reading, where Paul is speaking, and he's reciting some history. And the history that he's reciting isn't just any history. It's the history of Jesus' encounter with people. Remember that part where, and this is not going to be exactly the words that Cheryl used, but, and last to me as one untimely born, he appeared. He appeared to the 500. He appeared to these people. He appeared. Note, Paul is not saying, when Jesus was alive, he taught wonderful theology. Paul is not, though he did, Paul is not saying, when Jesus was getting his feet dirty in the dust of the Middle East, he was a good moral teacher. He is not saying Jesus went to his bar mitzvah classes, got bar mitzvah, and then became a rabbi and taught the Orthodox Jewish faith. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying that Jesus walked where he walked and did what he did to revitalize Judaism. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is he appeared. And his appearances are, for the most part, post-resurrection. This is a person who did all those things indeed, but then he died, and then he rose. And having risen, it wasn't just like a bunch of scholars sitting around having a holy huddle and saying, you know, we got to figure a way of preserving the teaching. So how can we do this? I know we're going to make up a bunch of lying stories about what he did when he was alive so that people will believe in him because of these stories. That's not what happened. Last he appeared to me as one untimely born. He appeared to the disciples. He appeared to the women. He appeared to the 500. It's all about the physical appearance and the interaction. It's all about pointing to it. And I could, as you would well know, probably some of you are doing it in your own brains, extrapolating and remembering Thomas. Thomas, put your finger in the holes. You know, I don't want you doubting this. Put your fingers in the hole, finger in the holes, and believe. It's about interaction. It's about the concrete. It's about the real. It's about the fact that Jesus, though, yes, he was a good moral teacher, was more than that. Though he was a great preacher, clearly, he had a way with words. He was more than that. Though he did wonderful things, it's not about the things, it's about where they point. And they point to the fact that this is the unique, divine Son of God. Yes or no? And the yes or no is a personal choice and a personal decision. And saying it's a personal choice and a personal decision, now I want to tell you a kind of personal story. The people who are involved in this story are all still alive, and some of them may even remember it. When I was in diocesan college, I think maybe some of you have heard some of this before. When I was in diocesan college, I had a number of jobs that I was using to earn my way, like to pay my way through McGill and through college. And one of them, for a couple of summers, at least during the day, was painting in the seminary. I don't mean art, painting. I mean walls, rooms, bathrooms, ceilings, all the rest of it. On this particular occasion, the previous principal of diocesan college had retired, and Bishop Hollis, Reg Hollis, had hired a new principal. And Reg Hollis, I think anybody who's been around here for more than a couple of months knows that I had great respect for Reg Hollis. He was a wonderful man and a wonderful bishop, even though he was incredibly quiet. And obviously, as a bishop, he wanted to hire a principal that was in keeping with his particular theology, which was, and I'll use a fancy word, it was Christocentric, very much centered on Christ. Not just the principles, but centered on the person of Jesus. And he hired, or was hired, a man by the name of Tony Capon. Tony Capon had a fan club, probably still does, and Tony Capon had detractors, probably still does. I ended up being in the fan club, and that would become apparent. My first encounter with Tony, he did not know who I was. I was entering into my final year, and I was on a scaffold on the third floor of Diocesan College in the middle of the summer, painting the ceiling. And he came up, and he was wandering around taking a look at the place, and so he started sort of, basically, he would probably say, he made requests. I won't say this because this is on YouTube, and someday he may view it. He was giving me orders, can you go and fix this and do that and do that? And so I said to him, yeah, that's a nice way to talk to one of your final year students. The look on his face was quite impressive. And so we met each other and we started talking. Tony wanted to take Diocesan College in a certain direction. And to say that he had some opposition would be an understatement. And there's no need to say more for the sermon, so I won't, but let's say there was opposition. Tony, there were some things that puzzled him about the way Diocesan College worked. I think the place where he'd been before, which I believe was Wycliffe, if you were a seminarian and you were going towards ordination, you did things like go to chapel. And you were part of a chapel schedule, chapel roster, leading services, doing readings and such like that, similar to the way we do it here. We had a tradition at Diocesan College of not attending chapel, even though there was supposed to be morning prayer and evening prayer, and a couple of times a week a communion service. it was basically considered very much optional prior to Tony. And Tony thought this was a little strange, and that we basically needed some direction. And so one time what he did was he drew up a schedule, filled in people's names, basically said, like, this is when you're on, da-da-da-da-da. Well, believe it or not, he really got stick over that. How dare he? Like, that was heavy-handed and imposing and all the rest of it. And he just didn't get it. He didn't get how you could be a person studying towards ordination and not be involved in spiritual development like that and in leadership like that. He just didn't get it. And I remember a conversation that I had with him once upon a time, just outside the door of the Principal's Lodge at Diocesan College. And I was a very different person in those days, much more brash than I am now, believe it or not. And he was expressing to me, he was hurting because he was expressing to me his confusion over this place. And maybe now he would say he was confused. But it struck me as confusion. Like, this is supposed to be a seminary training people for the ministry of God's church, in Christ's church. How come they don't go to chapel? And when you put somebody to go to chapel, you get in trouble for it. And there were all sorts of things happening. And though I really didn't understand him, and though if you pushed me, I probably would have said, well, chapel should be something that if you feel led to do it, you should, but you shouldn't be forced. That's probably where I would have come down in those days. There was something about his authenticity and the sincerity that I found very attractive, and frankly more attractive than a lot of what I was experiencing in my final year at Diocesan College. Well, that's a sense of how things were. And for me, it came to, but this is the personal story time, right? It came to a particular focus point when one time Tony had the group of final year Anglican students, there are 5 of us, into his lodge for a lunch. And we did this not irregularly, I think we did it about monthly, but this particular time, like you always do a Bible study and you do prayers and stuff like that. And let us pray, complain and stuff. And to say it was as superficial as a pie tin would do us disservice to pie tins, It really did tend to say very, very superficial, very, very surface. But on this particular occasion, and I don't remember what the reading was, it was something to do with the resurrection of Jesus. And we read the story, and Tony asked a question. And someday I'd love to know whether he remembers this and any of the other students do, but man, do I remember it. In the course of the discussion and conversation following the reading, we usually try to impress each other with our knowledge and our theology and our use of Greek words. He asked who believed in the resurrection of Jesus. And to word it that way is much more in your face. It was in the course of the conversation. I don't want to make it sound like, who believes in the resurrection of Jesus? Well, it wasn't like that. It was just in the course of the conversation. And we basically, one by one, expressed our position. 3 of the people there didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, or the divinity of Christ, because that follows from that. They believed that Jesus existed and was a good man and a good moral teacher, etc., 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 the lines. One person said that he did believe. And I hope it doesn't surprise you that person wasn't me. The guy's name was Roger O'Beard. And he's presently, I believe he's still in Maine, closer to retirement than I am. But Roger said that he did believe in the resurrection of Jesus, which in the years that I was going through McGill, to actually say that, you would be mocked, as something of a simpleton. We've grown beyond all that nonsense. And my response was, I don't know. That was my response, I don't know. Which I would follow up by saying, and I can just hear the arrogance in it now, I couldn't then. But that's not what's important, because what's important is what Jesus taught and the example he set. That to me was what's important. He taught people that love was a good idea. That's a pretty good thing. It's good that we remember that. And he taught people to care for each other and the poor and stuff like that. Those are pretty good ideas. So whether or not he was the Son of God, whether he rose from the dead or not, really isn't that important, because what's important is the teaching. And all 5 of us were ordained, which says something about the church. And you can use whatever discretion you have to, or whatever process you want to assess for yourself what it says about the church. But of the 5, I think I was in the worst shape. Because I was neither here nor there. Which is a really uncomfortable position to be in. I couldn't stay there forever. Because there is something incredibly compelling about this person, Jesus. And as I started to grow a bit spiritually, and after I was ordained and having to deal with spiritual stuff with people, I came to realize that my position, which was, it really doesn't matter whether he was who he said he was, because what's important is the teaching, was totally untenable. It is just logically untenable as a position. Because he connected what he did and what he said with who he was and who he was in relation with God. And you have to have your brain sealed in watertight ziplocs to ignore and deny the fact that Jesus identified himself with God. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. I am the way, the truth, and life. I am the bread of life. And that I am is not an accident. Remember when Moses said, who should I say sent me? I am. So Jesus equates himself. He says he's co-equal with God. That's what he does. And either that's a statement of truth, or it's a complete fallacy. So, you see what he did and what he said with who he was, and he identifies himself as a co-equal with God. Strikes me, when you think it through that way, that it becomes pretty important to make up your mind about whether he's telling the truth or not. Because if he's not, then everything falls apart like a house of cards. There is no purpose in us being here this morning if Jesus isn't who he says he is, or wasn't who he said he was. Everything we do in and through church, in terms of social justice and action and all the rest of it, can be done equally by other religious groupings or secular groupings. Caring for humanity is not exclusively the purview of Christians. And in fact, sometimes we do it poorly, if at all, and sometimes, often, incredibly inefficiently. But that is an outworking, an important outworking. But it's an outworking. What Christianity is about is that person standing there who said, put down your net and see what happens. And either he was who he said he was, which means he is who he said he is, or not. And it became incumbent on me to make up my mind. Is he telling the truth or not? Around that time, I can't honestly remember the exact chronology, I began to be exposed to a writer by the name of C.S. Lewis. Some of you will know that it was through Tolkien and one of Tolkien's friends that C.S. Lewis ended up having a conversion experience. Very much an intellectual, but very much a conversion experience for sure. And he wrote a book called Mere Christianity. And as I read that book, Mere Christianity, which is basically a Christian apologetic. Now, apologetic doesn't mean apology, it means explanation. And if you're struggling with who Jesus is, I really would suggest reading that book. I began to see that the same intellectual work that I was doing had been done much more rigorously and much more spectacularly by C.S. Lewis. But he basically came to the same conclusion, that either Jesus was who he said he was, therefore is who he says he is, or he's crazy, or worse. But you can't have a good man and a good moral teacher claiming to be God incarnate unless they're right or nuts. There's an incompatibility there. And as I read that, it helped clarify my thought. And I began to see that when we start trying to do works of goodness in our own human strength, we mess up. Or we get burned out. Or we get misguided, misdirected. Or our best intentions somehow go awry. And that when we recognize the centrality of the person of Jesus, it does truly and spectacularly make a difference. I hope I'm not boring you, because I got to give you page 2 or section B of this story. It became important to me in the same way that we baptize babies and parents take vows on behalf of the baby, then people affirm their vows at confirmation time. It became important to me as an ordained minister to reaffirm my commitment to Christ at a given point. But then I left the church that I was serving and went to a church where all that stuff about Jesus and the centrality of Jesus was considered peripheral at best. Wonderful people, wonderful minister I worked with, but from a theological perspective, very different from where I'd come to be. And I was put in charge of the youth group there, which there wasn't any people back there. There shortly was. And once upon a time, I took away on a retreat. And what I did on that retreat was talk about the life of Paul, very started and very intimate. Talk about his conversion experience and his encounter with Jesus. And what I said to them was, this too can happen to you in a way that is unique for you, if you want. But it's a choice of inviting God to be present and real in your life. And I invited those who were interested in doing that to stay behind to be prayed. And the leaders of the leaders to stay behind and pray. I had a thing in those days, and I still do, where if I'm the one that's preaching the invitation, I do not do the praying because there's too much of a danger, frankly, particularly with younger people, of cult of personality and personal loyalty being confused with spiritual loyalty. So I always absent myself from that prayer meeting. So what I did was I went into the hall, the parish hall, where the ones who didn't want to pray, a commitment of prayer, were, leaving 3 or 4 or 5 back in the church. Now this is not the church where this is the theology. This is brand new information to these kids. After a while, being a mature and caring minister, I decided to go in and see what was going on in the church part of things. And I got to tell you this, and unless you experienced it yourself, you can't believe it. Maybe you can trust me, but unless you're there, you can only say, well, it's Lorne telling the story, and he believes it, so I didn't trust him. He's either telling the truth or nuts, or lying for some reason. When I walked into that place, I was almost blown backwards by the sense of power that was there. And I truly understood for the first time in my life why on the day of Pentecost, when they described what it was like when the Holy Spirit came on the day of Pentecost, why they used terms like tongues of flame and rushing in the wind. Because those are descriptions of power. When I walked into that place, there was the feeling of power like we would. There were some tears. There was one particular girl, very shy and shy person, who was actually dancing. There were people praying. There was quietness, but strong quietness. There wasn't a whole lot of talking going on. And I just went, wow. And it was a spectacular appearance. And today, as I'm doing this sermon, I'm on one level re-experiencing it. And what happened for the rest of the time, I stayed in the church for a while and just sat back, frankly, and enjoyed it. All of the kids who were still in the parish hall from the youth group, one by one, came in until at about 4 o'clock in the morning, or whole 4 o'clock in the morning, youth group, all of them were back. All of them were back in the church. And in fact, one guy, his name was Jack, he had been sound asleep. At one point in his sleeping bag, he had sat bolt upright. Where's everybody? I'm going to church. And I'm going to church. It was really a remarkable, remarkable thing. And that reminds me, that event, or the readings today, sorry, I got that backwards. The readings today remind me of that event. Because the readings today are about encounter. Jesus encountered people where they are most able to accept and understand what's going on. The fishermen knew what was going on. The post-resurrection appearances, people knew that he was supposed to be dead, and now he's back to life. And you can't have that experience without it being life-transforming, or without wanting to change the brand of coffee you're drinking or something. It's either true or it's false. You can't go anywhere in between. And I'm reminded of that experience of that retreat at St. James Church in Stanbridge East almost 30 years ago now. And all those kids, because for them it became real. Not because I preached it, Not because they read about it in a story, not because they're brought up in the tradition, but because they had an experience of the risen Lord Jesus in the power of the Spirit. And that changed the lives of quite a number of them, some of them so much. So, when we read those Bible stories, let's not just read them as something that's a headline in the Jerusalem Herald. Amazing catch of fish. Get yours now. But realize that those signs, those wonders, those teachings are pointing to the reality of God becoming human so that you and I can encounter Him in a way that is unique and special to each and every one of us. Amen. Now let's pray. God, we thank you that in your love for your humanity, you come to us in various ways, in times and circumstances that you're choosing, sometimes in a time of need, sometimes in a time of great joy and celebration. But we thank you. Thank you for the glimpses you give us. And we pray for ourselves on our spiritual journey. No one complete, no one a destination. And we also say that, sometimes we just don't know what direction to go in. Sometimes we're confused, sometimes we're arrogant, sometimes we just don't know. So open our hearts, open our minds to understand what you have for us. Come to us, Lord. And Father, as the minister in charge of this place, I would pray that as we start Lent this week on Ash Wednesday, that Lent really truly would be a time of self-examination and spiritual self-examination, and that it would lead all of us to growth. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen.